Hello all, thanks for coming on this chilly December day. I would like to welcome you to another session in the Cryptography, Security and Privacy speaker series, the CrySP Privacy Speakers Series. So I would like to warmly welcome Dr. David Murakami Wood. Dr. Murakami Wood is currently a Canada Research Chair, a Tier 2 Research Chair in Surveillance Studies, and an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Queen's University. He's a widely published specialist in the sociology and geography of surveillance and security in cities from a global comparative perspective. And he particularly focuses on Japan, Brazil, Canada, and the UK. He's also a leading organizer in the field of surveillance studies, and he's the editor-in-chief of the international open access peer-reviewed journal Surveillance and Society. And he's the co-editor of the Surveillance Studies, a reader, which is published by Oxford University Press and forthcoming, and the editor of the other forthcoming Handbook of Cities and Security from Edward Elgar, as well as a consultant and in-demand media commentary on surveillance issues. He's also recently been added as a fellow to the Royal Society of Canada and the College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. So without further ado, I would like to welcome David.
Oh, it's not going to work, is it, really? Where's this going? Sorry, the volume, it's not necessarily that great, the sound there, but anyway, okay. View. Okay, just to remind you, those of you who remember with fondness, the greatest film about hacking ever made. Seriously, don't anybody, we'll have an argument about this afterwards, but don't anybody tell me that's not the greatest film about hacking ever made. Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is hacking not from a computer science perspective. And I'm no kind of computer scientist, as you'll soon find out. My computer programming experience probably began and ended with the Acorn Electron, one of the most terrible computers ever produced by the BBC Micro company in Britain, which was designed as an educational tool for children in the 1980s, and therefore could do nothing interesting whatsoever, although it did manage to produce a version of Elite without the aliens in it, which was, besides, sort of defeated the point. So I'm no kind of computer scientist. What I'm interested in this talk, and what I'm going to talk about, is the intersection of hacking practice and mythology with new forms of global planetary infrastructures that are emerging in the 21st century. So I'm going to go through a whole series of, firstly, theoretical propositions about how I think a sort of planetary infrastructure is emerging. Secondly, to think about some of the ways in which one might consider this planetary infrastructure. And thirdly, to look at some of the myths and stories of hacking that are relevant and important to this new time, and to consider how we might, again, think about these as avenues, both for, if you like, for confronting and dealing with this new kind of planetary infrastructure, whether indeed you want to support it or whether you want to actually subvert it or indeed destroy it completely. What do I mean when I say the planetary? It's not to be taken for granted. What I'm doing here is drawing on a number of different contemporary theorists working in different fields. This is a very interdisciplinary presentation. Indeed, I'm throwing things together that probably have no business being together at all, and that's something we may want to talk about later. First of all, I'm originally a geographer, despite working in a sociology department. I'm sort of undercover in sociology. I'm really an urban geographer. And what I've been really influenced by in this field is work by Brenner and Christian Schmid, which argues that we're becoming essentially, we're entering a condition of planetary urbanism. This doesn't mean that the entire planet is, as in Coruscant in Star Wars, one city, across the whole planet, but just that we are in a condition now where culturally and economically and in other ways, urbanism is becoming the dominant way of life. More of us are living in cities. It's now more than 50% of the world's population, although exactly when that occurred is a matter of debate, or if indeed if it has occurred yet. But urban culture dominates cultures around the world. It's urban things, urban forms are now becoming the reference points, even for those who are living far from cities. So if you like, we are entering a condition of planetary urbanism, as Brenner and Schmid define it. It's the norm, the new normality. Secondly, I'm drawing on work by a design scholar, Benjamin Bratton. Some of you may have read his enormous, slightly opaque book, The Stack, which has come out recently, in which he argues that we're slowly entering an age in which we are moving from just having networked communications and computing, the internet and such like, to a condition where the whole planet is becoming a sort of computing infrastructure. He uses this metaphor of the stack, as he calls it, drawn from computer architecture, as a metaphor, in some senses, talking about clouds and the cloud and all these kind of things that you might be used to, but also, in some ways, as a way of thinking about the future of computing itself, and arguing that, in fact, we are moving to a situation in which computing is being increasingly infiltrated into all kinds of systems. Of course, architecturally, as we know from things like smart cities, and I'll talk about this in a minute, into our cells through various forms of implants, medical and otherwise, into animals, into the environment more broadly, and gradually spreading to a situation in which one can consider these linked and network systems, not so much as an Internet of Things, but as an entire planetary stack. So it's a very interesting book. It will annoy the absolute living hell out of you if you're a computer scientist, probably, but that's why it's worth reading, right? Thirdly, of course, we are in an era of planetary environmental crisis. It's undeniable. Whatever Donald Trump says, the Chinese did not invent global warming. It's happening, we're living with it, and it's not the only environmental crisis that we're facing. This environmental crisis will define and determine the politics of the 21st century. It already is. And the consequent need to develop forms of planetary environmental management are also conditioning this new planetary mode of life. Now, it may seem hard to imagine that this is going to be a smooth transition to this at the moment, given that we're entering an age in which it seems that there's a reaction against this. Everybody's retreating to nationalism, to authoritarianism, to safe, it seems, forms of kind of hierarchical ideology, which seem to contradict the idea that we would be entering something resembling a planetary civilization which could manage the planet in any kind of way. What I'm suggesting, in fact, is that this moment we're in right now is a kind of, it's actually an indication of how strong this planetary condition is and how much people are unable to deal with the implications, right? The retreat to certainties offered by things like fascism and authoritarianism is precisely because these problems are so huge and the necessity for them to be confronted is so strong that people cannot cope with that. And I think I hope it's a temporary indication. That's what I'm arguing here. These systems, in many ways, are tied together by forms of planetary surveillance, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute. So what we're entering is a period of human history, perhaps, where the idea of the planetary is here to stay. The idea that we could enter a kind of planetary civilization is here to stay. And how I started thinking about this was actually not through any of these theorists, but through the work of exobiologist from the 1960s, Nikolai Kardashev, the Russian biologist, exobiologist, planetary astrophysicist, if you like, who developed this way of categorizing planetary civilizations, how we would categorize different civilizations in the universe were we to find them. And he argued that the first level of this kind of civilizational structure would be the mastery of energy resources in one planet. Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, supplemented this with a measure of information dominance later on, and also calculated where he thought we were on Kardashev's scale, which was around about 0.7. We weren't actually even at that planetary level yet. What I'm arguing is we're now entering a period in which we seriously can be considered to be becoming a planetary civilization in the sense that Kardashev argued, but also in the sense of informational mastery that Carl Sagan argued. We're not there yet, by the way, but I think his sort of measures of scale of information infrastructure and information usage, we're getting there. Especially if we're in a phase now as the NSA are at least alleged to have storage capacities entering what some people argue is a yottabyte level of capacity, although other people have argued this is not true. This leads to other implications, sort of broader implications. Firstly, the question of sovereignty, for example. I mean, we just talked about the possibility that we're entering a brief period of a reaction, retreat to nationalism and authoritarianism. But Bratton argues, in fact, that the main change we're going to experience this century is a move towards what he calls platform sovereignty. That is, moving away from the idea of nation-state as the main way in which we understand our allegiances and our connections, to a situation in which we basically understand computing systems and competing ideas of computing and communication systems as providing those means of belonging for each other. You can see this already in some of the kind of loyalties that people seem to have to different operating systems. It's an early precursor of this sort of argument. And those of you in computing will be very familiar with the intensity of these kinds of arguments that in some ways do already outstrip real politics for many people. What he's arguing, though, is that these are already becoming real politics. Arguments about standards, arguments about how infrastructures are going to be constructed are going to be real, they are real political arguments if we're entering an era in which we have a planetary scale of computing infrastructure. And they matter, right? They really matter. Questions about standards in some ways are the most boring questions imaginable, but they're also some of the most important. At the moment, of course, as I said, we're not there. We're in this period of flux where we seem to have no sign of any sort of conventional idea of a planetary government. We're not in the sort of Star Trek era of, the planetary government in San Francisco and everybody thinking about how they're going to relate to other planets. We're nowhere near that yet. But in a sense, the kind of governmentality, as Foucault would describe it, of this period is already here. We are already performing government in various ways at a planetary level. And I'll talk about some of these as we go on. Of course, as I said, this is not a complete process. It's almost a science fiction, a sort of social science fiction I'm presenting here at this stage. Just like the components and foundations that make up all this system, this planetary surveillance network, which I described as underpinning this, is in no way even complete or even the same thing in different places. If you like using Bratton's language, the stack is no way near of equal depth everywhere at all. It's also in no way equalizing. This is not some idea that we're entering a world of some perfect computer-generated communism where everybody gets equal access to information and it's all some kind of utopia as envisaged by the early enthusiasts of the internet in the 1990s, the sort of, the homesteading on the electronic frontier type of discourse. It's not going to be like that. It isn't like that. In fact, many of these trends are actually exacerbating existing divisions and changing the conditions of life in ways that are actually adding to people's forms of inequality and lack of ability to take part. I'd also say for those of you who are interested in surveillance in particular in the room, that what this also indicates is a different kind of way of thinking about how surveillance functions. Many of you will be aware of Michel Foucault's ideas about panopticism. This idea that surveillance functions like some kind of central control where there is a guard in a guard tower who, or maybe not, but who can actually see the prisoners, and the prisoners behave as if they are being watched. Essentially, they internalize the watching of this guard who may or may not be there. This kind of all-seeing surveillance has never really functioned once it gets beyond the sort of an institutional scale. But in fact, as we know from the way that stuff works or does not work in reality, there was never likely to be a functional form of panopticism on any sort of scale larger than this. Bruno Latour, who's a very interesting science and technology studies scholar, has argued that in fact surveillance in this period is what he calls oligoptic. What it means is there are lots of very narrow seeing kind of mechanisms, and we pass through all these different things, and we're seen differently at different times by different systems. I'd also add that actually there's also many broad and superficial forms of surveillance that keep monitoring us in different ways. So we're in this sort of meshwork of surveillance, none of which is total, and all of which actually has different intensities depending on our social position and all those other kinds of factors that we ourselves are a part of. So whether you're racialized, whether you're a particular kind of gender and so on, these all affect the intensity to which you're monitored. But also location, where you are in the world really matters still. Another more complicated idea that I'm playing with quite a lot now is that surveillance often these days takes on another form, which is that in fact it often acts in this situation to justify itself. And if you look at the way globalization has occurred, a lot of the forms of surveillance that support globalization, especially economic and military forms, it's actually sort of self-generating and self-sustaining. So surveillance acts almost to protect the very thing that is doing the surveillance. You can see this in small scales in the fact that now surveillance cameras are increasingly being armored, and you have cameras to watch cameras to make sure that people don't steal or damage the cameras. There's many examples of this, but this functions on a global scale too. All forms of surveillance have this kind of looking back capacity that acts to justify itself. It becomes a self-sustaining system, rather in the way that Weber argued about bureaucracy. We're now seeing a sort of techno-bureaucratic development which makes technology start to acquire their own sorts of self-justifications. And you can see this, by the way, in some of the arguments about particular systems, the early arguments about platform sovereignty. Think of Bill Gates and .NET, to use a bit of a historic example. Think of the frustration. We remember him with his speech he gave when he was, a few years ago, when he was wondering why people would not be part of .NET, why they weren't taking it up. And he was saying, don't they understand the system will not work if they don't sign up? As if the idea of the system functioning should be the reason for people to actually take part in it. It's a very interesting sort of circular logic of thinking about these kind of things. I'd say planetary surveillance also involves actually not just the scale of the planetary, but things being deeper and more infiltrated into life itself. And we'll see some examples of this. So what does this look like? What are the examples I'm going to give you at this stage of early precursors of this kind of planetary infrastructure? Well, some of them, of course, we've become very familiar with. Of course, these are claims. This is the NSA's, one of its internal slides from the Snowden files about its planetary surveillance system. Its massive collection of data collection sites, of download sites, of all kinds of different espionage functions across the world. It doesn't really matter what they are right now. The point is to note its spread and to note its kind of intensity across the world. Of course, these are claims. Even internally, they're claims, and they don't reflect some kind of reality of functioning, that these things work properly, already do the things they're supposed to do. As we know, situation normal, all fucked up, military, discourse, that everything is always failing. That's one of the things you can be certain of. You can see this in the kind of infiltration of security systems, integrated surveillance and security systems into all sorts of devices and areas right now. These are some border security devices that exist which combine surveillance and lethal function in this case. So this is a semi-automated guard post on the Israeli-Palestine borders that is not yet fully independent but could be made to be so. Some of the systems that exist on the Saudi Arabian border provided by EADS, which is a British consortium, are supposed to have some automated lethal function, although of course it's very difficult to go and investigate them. Basically, it's a kind of technical version of the shoot first, ask questions later doctrine. And these kinds of automated systems, automated weapon systems, are spreading. One can see the beginnings of this, of course, in smart cities. And one of the things I'm studying right now is the place of security and surveillance within smart city systems. One of the cliches of smart cities right now is these multifunctional street lamps, these sort of pods that have all kinds of sensory devices and things that connect to what we would conventionally understand as a street lamp, and therefore collect all kinds of data of different kinds from passers-by, from environmental kind of functions of the city and so on, and are supposed to provide for greater flow, for traffic, to help people move more smoothly and so on. As you can see, the head of the Rio de Janeiro system is incredibly happy about all this. It all works fine, nothing's going wrong. Rio de Janeiro functions perfectly as a city now, as you all know. You can see this to an extent in these new forms of security and surveillance that are now starting to exist in all kinds of unexpected environments and in unexpected ways. So this, for example, is a portable terahertz wave scanner being used by New York police. Essentially a portable naked body scanner. It uses bodily emanations to kind of make a naked picture under the clothes. This has gone from being a theoretical possibility 15 years ago to now being a functioning example outside in the environment. This is a kind of night scope robot, which looks like this sort of Dalek type thing, which is now patrolling various car parks in Silicon Valley. I should tell you as well, the Chinese have already made a weaponized version of this, so if it's gone from being just a kind of surveillance device to being a killer robot within a very short space of time. As I said, these things are also about infiltration. They're about the very small and the way surveillance and systems are starting to infiltrate into living forms and living beings in various ways. We're seeing biomimetics, the creation of robotics, where things are imitating natural forms, like this robo-bee from Harvard that many of you have probably seen. Very tiny sensor devices that can be networked together, like these from Hitachi, to the same sort of scale as a human hair. And this will be seen as big in a few years' time, by the way, these kind of things. I'll leave the showdown Internet of Things stuff for later. You can see it in the way in which we're willing now to monitor all aspects of our own lives, how we give up virtually all our information on social media and start to sort of film and advertise our own existence through various kinds of channels of self-surveillance and being aware of our performance as human beings and aware that we're being monitored or encouraging ourselves to be monitored for various reasons. And of course, this goes way beyond just ourselves into other living beings too. There's so many tagged animals out there, systems of surveillance that encompass whole ecosystems, like the Brazilian Sensipam system that monitors the Amazon rainforest for deforestation, drug running, all other kinds of stuff. There's almost nowhere on the planet now that you can be free of surveillance in one way or another. Essentially, it might not be the same system. It's not Big Brother sitting there like, you know, going, ha ha, you're all under surveillance. But the systems that blanket the planet are now becoming such that it is impossible really to be outside of surveillance systems. So the question I sort of want to ask in this is, what kind of politics do we have? And this is where I lead into the hacking thing. Is it possible to have a planetary civilization, you know, say only with surveillance that encourages human flourishing and all those lovely things? Is it possible to have one without surveillance at all? At the moment, it seems very unlikely. What are the kind of lines of flight, as Gilles Deleuze would say? What are the ways out of this? One, of course, is quite common and understood by computer scientists, the various open movements that exist to try and create kind of under control participatory forms of computing and surveillance in various ways. There's also all kinds of tools of circumvention that, again, have been developed by computer scientists, and I don't need to tell you about those, Tor and so on. And of course, the current favorite silver bullet solution to everything is blockchain, which apparently without any real rationality is going to solve everything, as you know. We only know, I put Ethereum on here because when I first started to hear about this was through the Ethereum project leaders who gave a presentation, which I saw, and you all know what has happened with Ethereum since and its particular kinds of investment strategies and so on. It's not looking like it's the perfect, you know, poster child for solving these problems at all. Yet these kinds of distributed computing systems are, I think, characteristic of the way in which computing is going to develop in a planetary and infrastructural way. Whether it's this one or not, I don't think. And of course, one of the other options is taking control through forms of hacking, and this is what I'm going to talk about for the last part of this talk. Now, hacking practices themselves, though, are subject to all kinds of mythologies, and to understand what sort of things we're talking about when we're talking about hacking in the context of planetary infrastructures, we have to go through some of these stories and see how they might be applicable. So, of course, for most of you in the room, the first thing that's really obvious, you know, it's like hacking isn't actually about breaking into computer systems. It's programming, right? It's coding. That's what it is. That's what it was originally. All those people who talk about hacking, it's like, it's not really breaking into stuff. You know, media should stop talking about it this way. And that's one of the things that annoys computer programmers constantly in some ways. And in fact, for many people within these, working with some of these more political forms of sort of open source and open access things, there's also a particular nuance to the idea of hacking that has to do with participation and engagement with programming in various ways. So this is where you get the sort of hackathons and hackerspaces and all that good stuff that we all like to encourage. I guess this has a very strong connection to that older internet ideology, that sort of, you know, the stuff that's represented by hackers on planet Earth and that sort of liberatory, you know, libertarian sort of possibility of the internet that still kind of hovers about the edges of things, that isn't entirely dead. However, this is also increasingly recuperated into corporate ecologies of various kinds. You've probably noticed that Microsoft is increasingly branding hackerspaces in the same way that Reebok started to brand CrossFit a few years ago. It started as this movement from people, and then Reebok bought up the name, and everything's now Reebok CrossFit. Now it's sort of Microsoft hackerspaces. I've seen these in various cities around the world. Kids get taught to program Microsoft way, which is like, for most of the people in the room, is like, oh my God, no, please, no, not that, anything but that. And of course, the idea is that they grow up in that brandscape, if you like, in that system of thinking about software and about coding. It's not entirely kind of about, you know, a sort of giving people stuff. In fact, I think, as you know, as computer people know more than anyone else, the first thing you should be concerned about is if people give you stuff for free. It's like, what's actually being generated here? Who's paying? What am I being asked to pay for in a different way? Of course, the state's vision of hacking and the media's vision of hacking is an attack on infrastructure predominantly. This is about bad people trying to destroy your computer, your electricity system, and so on. Has all kinds of roots in different ideas about criminality, about resilience, critical infrastructure protection, and so on, which I don't have time to go into today. I mean, the thing I've been researching most is this sort of idea of these attacks on supervisory control and data acquisition systems, the idea of defending and attacking the fundamental infrastructure that underlies computing in various ways. And this kind of vision of hacking pretty much dominates the media discourse. However, it's been contested by a third version now, which is the idea of the rise of hacking as a kind of political practice. And this has been really curious in the last 10 years, really. We haven't seen this before. You know, hackers used to be thought of, if they were these terrible people threatening systems, as kind of, if they weren't terrorists, they were kids, right? Just doing it for fun. They were, you know, people who are just doing it for a laugh, doing it for prestige, all of that stuff, which was kind of true in the early days of hacking, if you go back to Captain Crunch and phreaking and all that stuff, as we'll see. But WikiLeaks and so on, and especially the growth of Anonymous and LulzSec and those kind of organizations have led to this sort of actual overt assertion of a hacking politics, which is quite different from the kind of world of, actually, even though they say it for the lulz, it's not really for the lulz anymore. It's not really at all for the lulz. And this actually has kind of led to another sort of pushback from the state, essentially has tried to gather these hacking, political hackers together with terrorists and cyber criminals and so on. And you saw this in the calls for Julian Assange to be extraordinarily rendered, for Snowden to be assassinated, and all those other kinds of things that were said by mainstream politicians, even in Canada. That, you know, why doesn't somebody just kill Snowden? Which is quite extraordinary if you think about it in many ways. These sort of narratives of hacking, these various narratives, rely on sorts of myths, and I'm going to go through some of these to kind of see how they work. I just mentioned the phone phreakers. Of course, the origin myth of hackers themselves is this is their story, the story of hackers, right? It goes back to California, all those kids with their little whistles, they got out of the Captain Crunch cereal things, get on the phone, and they can then sort of, you know, mess with the exchange, you know, mess with the dial tone things with these whistles. It's partially true, right? It's not a myth entirely, but the way in which this is exaggerated as a form of practice becomes a sort of, you know, it's like any origin story. It's a good story, it works, it's partly true, but also it's, you know, vastly exaggerated. And it's been supplemented by a lot of the science fictional sort of visions of hacking that have, you know, have made this into a kind of myth. You know, like the archetypal sort of infrastructure hacking scene in Neuromancer, William Gibson's novel, and numerous Hollywood films, including, of course, Hackers, the best hacking film in the world ever. More recently, of course, we actually have had some more serious portrayals, or attempts to, like Mr. Robot, which, you know, at least in the first series, many people were convinced it was actually a pretty good portrayal of some of the ideologies and things that were going on. The second series has got a bit damn weird. So you haven't seen it? Okay. Okay, I'll just say it's weird. That won't surprise you that it's weird. Okay. I binge watched the entire second series recently. It was like, yeah, it gets really strange, believe me. And of course, even some journalism and academic studies sort of both deconstruct but also aid this mythology. So Gabriella Coleman's work, which is superb anthropological work into Anonymous, you know, really deconstructs all this stuff, but also she admits at various times she gets caught up in this whole thing. She gets really excited by the fact she's getting closer to the core of this sort of, you know, hacking politics, and, you know, it's inevitable, I guess. This is Neuromancer, and of course, yes, hackers. Exactly, they're so accurate, right? This is all of us. And then sort of games of various kinds. So one of the most key things I've been watching recently, these growth of these online games that sort of simulate hacking in a really blunt and unrealistic way. So you can, in Watch Dogs, essentially, who's played Watch Dogs here? Yeah, essentially, some of you haven't, but you play this kind of like, you know, urban outlaw who's got to like survive by ducking and diving and then, you know, hacking traffic lights and then moving slowly up to some more serious infrastructure kind of hacking where you take over the city in various ways. And the idea is that you become the sort of top hacker. And it kind of has a lot of connection, I think, to the kind of portrayal of hacking in Mr. Robot, although that's a much more kind of, as it says here, much more concerned with the post-9/11 political climate as much of computer systems itself. The other kind of mythology of hacking is the one I've already alluded to earlier on with the idea of snafu, of course, which, remember, the idea that everything is always going wrong. Remember, by the way, this is the lowest level. There's actually a military discourse of this. There's actually several levels of fucked up above this, including FUBAR, which is the fucked up beyond all recognition one, which is the top level, which you all should know. So bear in mind that this is the ordinary one. Thrift and Graham's work on failure of systems, revealing how things work, is in this vein. But really the key sort of mythological point here is war games. Classic film from the 1980s. And what's really interesting about war games, this is the one where the kid hacks into the nuclear simulation and, you know, thinks he's playing a game and then teaches the the computer ethics through playing tic-tac-toe. Anyway, it teaches the computer that war can't be won, basically, that it's inevitably going to destroy everybody. It's great. Of course, that's exactly how AI will work. You'll just... To believe it, there's another recent version of this, by the way, in Robert Sawyer's WWW trilogy. I don't know if anybody's read this, where basically a young blind girl teaches the new emergent AI ethics because she's so lovely, and the computer learns how to love humanity. It's kind of ridiculous, but there you go. But this, interestingly, War Games has real-life connections into this because President Reagan watched it, and like President Reagan learned a lot through films. Basically, his advisors were constantly showing him Hollywood films to educate him about foreign policy issues. It's basically saying, those guys are the Russians, and we're the Americans, and that's what happens when you do this. Anyway, he watched War Games and was so struck by this that he asked General Vesey, one of his advisors, to start a research process to investigate the possibilities of this kind of hacking into national infrastructure. Weirdly enough, though, the actual scriptwriters lived next door to somebody who used to advise the NSA. And actually, he actually worked with them on making it more kind of, realistic. So you might laugh at War Games, but there was a weird actual connection to national security stuff in it. And somehow the NSA's view then got passed on to Ronald Reagan by some really strange route through this. Of course, this mythology of war games, or the idea that a kid could just break into the kind of any computing system and change the world or whatever, has been widely believed by people in authority. So Kevin Mitnick, who was a famous hacker who was arrested for hacking of various kinds, he was put in solitary confinement without any access to telecommunications because they believed he might be able to use his mobile phone to start a nuclear war. It's entirely the scenario that resulted from war games, and this was like the justification for placing this guy in solitary confinement, was essentially that he was too dangerous to be trusted with any kind of communication system at all. Of course, then there's the one I'm sure that everybody in this room is familiar with, because it's all you, right? The white hat heroes, the systems administrators, the programmers who defend everything against these terrible people outside them. Imagine, of course, you're all on this side of the divide, of course. If you go back to this was really started, this sort of discourse really comes from a fantastically interesting and rather strange book by a guy called Clifford Stoll, who wrote this book, The Cuckoo's Egg, which is really weird, by the way. It's a great account of his own discovery of the fact there was a Russian hacker in military and academic networks in the USA in the 1980s, interspersed with accounts of his bohemian life in San Francisco and all the kind of weird parties he's going to. It's kind of cool, but kind of really quite strange in some parts. The weird thing about this whole episode, which was real, of course, is the damage caused by this hacker was incredibly minor. There's actually almost no evidence that there was any kind of actual threat to national security, actual damage caused, which is actually quite a consistent theme in some of these accounts of hacking. You look at the attempts to say this was very costly or this cost this much, and actually when you look into it, very hard to prove there's any real financial damage in some of these cases. But this theme of the kind of the hero who prevents the terrible hacking incident is another key sort of mythological strand in this. I think you can see other things like Cory Doctorow's famous short story, When Sysadmins Rule the World, which is a great story which sort of puts the sysadmins as heroes. More contemporary versions are now starting to emerge, though, which might be more relevant to our present conundrum and our present trends. And this idea now that we're getting to be very paranoid about the Internet of Things. And we've seen a lot of this stuff recently with, the denial of service attacks that have been seen recently, supposedly utilizing Internet of Things devices to cause various kinds of website crashes or other more serious accounts. And apparently some of them are the biggest ever network attacks in the world. And you see this kind of stuff being bandied about quite a lot. It may or may not be true, but that's not really the point for a myth, right? Myths are true as they need to be. We see a lot of this in films now with the idea, it's pretty become a standard cliche of traffic lights being hacked, just like in Watchdog, right? Traffic lights always being hacked in these films. The idea being that somehow if you could disable the transport system, then basically bad people could move about the city, but everybody else would be stuck. Because of course good people drive cars, right? It's the American thing. Good people drive cars. Only bad people and weirdos actually walk or do anything like that. So if you disable all the cars, then actually weirdos will profit, which actually sounds quite good to me. Streetlights have also been one of these things. So because streetlights are now the archetypal sort of, technology that's in this smart city sort of idea, these multifunction pods or streetlight systems, there's a lot of concern with hacking these sorts of systems as well, and a lot of work around security in these areas. I'd also point to, in the military field, the concern with the fact that ordinary people might be able to use very simple technologies to do quite destructive or innovative things. And And I say destructive and innovative because often these things work together, right? So in 2010, there was a famous incident when it was discovered that Shiite forces in Iraq, basically insurgent forces, had used a really cheap Russian satellite TV grabbing system to hack into US surveillance drones. And we're on the ground sitting watching the feeds from all the US surveillance drones while the US thought they had complete access to this technology and no one was doing it. So they were able to see exactly what the US were able to see and therefore adjust their strategies accordingly, using something that was worth $25 when the drones, of course, are billions of pounds worth of, really, really expensive sort of important investment. There's the whole thing, the whole figure of the virus. And I use this to describe, as most people do in common sense terms rather than technical terms, all these other kinds of things. We know are all different, Trojans, worms, da-da-da-da-da-da. But the discourse around these is this idea of the infiltration, the kind of destructive and almost incomprehensibly small things that can get into systems and bring them down. Interestingly, for this kind of mythological pathway, there really is a myth at the heart of this, an actual story that seems not to be true at all. So Thomas Rid, the security researcher from Britain, has pretty comprehensively shown that the Trojan attack, which supposedly occurred in Siberia in the early 80s and caused a pipeline explosion by infiltrating a Trojan into an 8-bit system that controlled flow in this oil pipeline, which, by the way, was absolutely impossible at the time. Anyway, technically impossible. He showed that actually this never happened. This actual explosion never happened. It didn't actually occur. There was an explosion later in a different place that seems to have been made into this. But this was entirely a story told by a Russian defector for a particular reason that, it's like a game of Chinese whispers. There was no actual event at the end of it. It didn't happen. And yet a lot of policy work on the idea of defending against infrastructure against Trojans always bases itself in this. This is the first one. This is why we need to take precautions. Of course, the other big origin of this is not an attack at all. It was the blackout caused by the system itself being inadequately designed, which caused the brownout, I guess, across the northeast of the USA and into Canada back in the early 2000s. And this resulted in a lot of wargaming around grid attacks, indeed the Aurora hacking demonstration in 2007. Now, finally, of course, we have actually got evidence recently of a power network attack in the Ukraine, although that's a bit murky too about what actually happened there, whether there really was a hacking attack or whether there was some other physical kind of situation that caused that. But maybe there was. Maybe we have good evidence now. Of course, Gabriella Coleman in her book also provides evidence that this is what they're really concerned about. The only time the CIA pulled her in during her research was precisely to ask her about whether Anonymous could take down the electricity grid. That seems to be the only thing they were concerned about. Can they do this? Are they there waiting, poised to... Didn't even ask whether Anonymous would actually be interested in doing such a thing, which of course they're not. But they were really concerned that they could do this. Other emergent kind of ideas and myths of hacking are now starting to come, though, which actually relate more directly to this idea of a planetary grid. Biohacking is starting to become a really strong and emergent sort of discourse here. And this is basically genetic research moving out of the lab and into the garage, if you like. Into the home. And there's good reason to be somewhat concerned about this. I mean, you can now buy these $100 CRISPR kits, which will actually enable you to snip bits out of DNA and create some form of genetic engineering at the most basic level. In fact, Ben Bratton, the author I mentioned earlier, does a workshop every year with his design students in San Diego, just doing this, snipping DNA, making new little bits and pieces, and it's part of their assessment. You can buy this stuff. So if you want to mess around and do some genetic engineering, as it says here, I like the little bit you get with the kit, the sticker you get with the kit, which refers directly back to this clip I started at the beginning. Biohack the planet is now the slogan here. So we're already starting to treat, if you like, these biological systems as cybernetic systems in much the same way that we treat computer systems. And I think this is actually indicative of a growing sort of crossover, and which Bratton points to too. You can see this also in some of the work being done on storage of information in DNA. The idea actually will be to use DNA as storage devices in various ways, using cells as living data storage. Usually this is in the context of like DNA that's out of the body. It's not talking about storing things in bodies, but you can technically probably do that in various ways with the amount of unused DNA that apparently we have. I'd be interested to see who volunteers to be the first living hard drive and see what happens if you happen to... What could possibly go wrong, right? And finally, of course, we're going up to the really big level in terms of hacking. Planetary hacking itself, the hacking of our climate and our environment, is going to be increasingly necessary in various ways. Right? The idea that the planetary system, the system of wind and water and all these kind of things could actually, or will actually have to be interfered with in various ways if we're to confront the problems of global environmental change, is one that's now starting to be taken very seriously. We have the Oxford Principles on Geoengineering, which sort of set out the ethical ways in which this might take place. Again, it's treating the planet itself as a cybernetic system in much the same way in which one can make targeted interventions. But of course, then there are also people who are advocating various kinds of more populist versions of this. And of course, there's already a ready-made conspiracy theory that's evolved, a ready-made narrative or myth that's come out of this, based in this old idea of the chemtrails thing. These people who believe that we're all being controlled by planes spraying chemicals from the air over the top of us. This has now been adapted into the geoengineering sort of story. So people are believing that we're already doing, government is secretly already geoengineering the planet, but it's to make us all slaves, right? Not to solve the environmental crisis. They're already up there spreading stuff down there to make us all part of some world system. So what kind of directions can we get out of this in terms of thinking about hacking the planet? I think one of the first questions to ask is the question about security that often comes up here. All of this stuff is often cast within a logic of cybersecurity. I mentioned earlier on about the idea that these are threats. But the question is here, what is the threat in this context? Are we talking about a threat to planetary infrastructures as being the primary thing we should be concerned about? Or should we actually be thinking about what the threat of planetary infrastructures is? Every system that we create creates vulnerabilities, right? And you've got to ask at some point, do we need to do this? Do we need to have this in the particular way that we do? Is it worth creating this kind of thing if its consequences of its hacking are actually really serious? And I'm suggesting as we move more towards the combination, particularly of computing and biology, that those questions become rather more literally life and death kind of questions. We're not there yet, by the way. This is a long way off, but those become literally more life and death kind of questions. I think it's important to consider some of these myths and roots into this, because what you call things, how you understand things, how you narrate things really matters to what they become. It's not just talking about stuff. There's too many examples of how people understand these kinds of systems through these complex metaphors that emerge from stories and films and so on, that have actually turned out to be the way in which systems have been developed, like Star Wars. I mean, the Strategic Defense Initiative here, not the film, which actually was deliberately referred to in these terms in order to acquire a certain cachet amongst people, and also to help Ronald Reagan understand what it was again, which is another thing. But there's also an underlying logic here that we're in a cybernetic age, right? We're dealing with an age in which cybernetic logics of various kinds have already started to recast the way we understand government. This should make people in this room incredibly powerful in some ways. You may not think you are. But the kind of logic that underlies computing is starting to be one which determines the kind of ways in which people understand and interpret the world more broadly. And you may think most people are idiots. They probably are, but they still, at least they think they're thinking in the ways that have been determined by people like ourselves in this room. So understanding that sort of logic and how it can be worked out is very important. It's recasting government. Governments talk in these terms now. It's recasting ecologies and geologies as forms of infrastructure at a planetary level, as systems, and indeed, if you want to consider the whole thing, the planetary itself as a kind of master system. All of the things I mentioned earlier, the participatory programming, the transparency, the potential for control, still exist in this logic. They don't disappear. They haven't been crushed or anything. But however, the problem is that these possibilities that kind of are generated through this participation have now become connected into the other discourse of security, where they become possible threats. So things like openness, like citizen participation, are viewed with a certain kind of suspicion that these are avenues for people to do bad things. And the possibility that you could actually create forms of open reprogramming start to be considered as a really serious danger and something that terrorists could abuse and so on. This is why, in a sense, we're in an age as well where, in order for something to be challenged, there has to be a war on it. It's declared as something that needs to be defeated, and you end up with being on the wrong side suddenly of an argument that you never intended to be on. Somebody who's an enemy, not somebody who's doing something good. But I want to ask, though, what are the positive possibilities out of this for forms of hacking that might combine the kind of positive pathways that have come out of computer system, operations of various kinds, computer network operations, and to kind of consider how these might be appropriated into thinking in that kind of way that people like Anonymous have started to encourage us to think of computing as having a politics, to think of hacking as having a politics, and to consider what this might mean if we consider it more seriously on a wider scale. What kind of positive possible futures can there be, including in the possibilities of fracture, of breakdown, and disconnection. It's not always just about connecting more things together. Sometimes you can think about how you might positively break things, disconnect them, and remake them maybe in other ways. I'll leave the final point because I have a kind of sense in which maybe some of this stuff also, the ideas within the Internet of Things discourses are often about, making things alive. Well, everything is already alive, right? In a sense, maybe we can rediscover the fact that the world is actually a living thing that we exist on, and we're part of that. We won't need to work so hard to try and make everything alive when it already is, and to consider what that might mean for some of our thinking about this stuff. Okay, that's all I'm going to say today. It's already gone on too long. Thanks.
About the work.
Sorry. And I'm aware this is all a bit kind of like more wacky than the stuff you're already used to, by the way.
About the war game.
Yeah.
I remember seeing it on a flight from New York to Los Angeles. And laughing my head off at the computer scientist thought was so ridiculous. It was a comedy. I mean,
Yeah.
I considered it a comedy because the whole notion that a computer that was so old that you could see the light flashing could do a simulation like that in the time
Yeah.
that it did it.
Yeah.
That was just outrageous.
Yeah.
So I remember laughing my head off throughout the movie.
Yeah.
And the other people watching it, they had looks on their faces that they were scared shitless.
Yeah.
And my laughing wasn't helping.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, but the strange thing is, I mean, as ludicrous as it was, this was an incredible influence on US military policy, right? Through Ronald Reagan's commissioning of General Vesey. It's actually pretty much, maybe you could argue, that war games helped to determine the future of American cybersecurity strategy. And that, if you like, is one of the most ludicrous things of all.
Well, I mean, for the first time in my life, I thought like I'm a mad scientist. You know, in the typical movie,
Yeah.
the mad scientist is always laughing his head off.
Yeah, because he has more knowledge than everybody else, and like
Yeah,
no one
right,
knows.
yeah.
Well, that's true, right? I mean, it's one of the things you see again and again in hackers, which I keep mentioning. For anybody who's actually involved in any kind of hacking operations, Hackers is the most ludicrous movie ever. Yet, but somehow it is funny, but it also is funny in a kind of different way because it also makes heroes out of these people who, most of us always wanted to be heroes like that, but we never would be. And so it's kind of ludicrous again, but it has a different kind of resonance. So it's a great favorite, I think, of it. I mean, as I said, it's the greatest hacking movie ever, and it's a great favorite of actual hackers all around the place because it's just sort of, so naive, but so much fun. And makes us seem so great, different things.
I remember the 2003 blackout, and I thought that there was some kind of Microsoft worm. Like the story that I heard at the time was that there was a Microsoft worm. So there was originally the outage, and then the Microsoft worm was making communications between computers really slow or something.
That might have been the case, yeah. There was certainly no virus or Trojan or worm of any kind involved in the actual reasons for the blackout, for the brownout, I should say, because it's technically not a blackout as such. But yes, I've heard that there was some communication difficulties caused by another kind of aspect of this, but it was nothing to do with the reason why the whole electricity network was brought down. That was entirely because of essentially aging infrastructure and lack of maintenance and poor planning. But of course, even the presence of a virus of some kind of worm and this blackout in the same kind of space was enough to convince people that this was something that needed to be talked about. So I think the exercises they did from then on were sort of more based on the fact that there was a kind of coincidence of things. It wasn't actually that if there was such a kind of a worm or virus, that it actually nothing to do with causing it, but certainly it was in the same kind of space, the same story somewhere, and that's enough really sometimes to give a kind of impetus for something to happen. And that's the importance of stories, right? It wasn't actually part of the main narrative. It's like a subplot, but that was enough.
So I forget who gave the quote about the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So have the outlines of the surveillance society been set now? The idea that the surveillance is there, it's sitting in a big database, and 10 years later they can go back and decrypt it, find out what's going on, or is there going to be some way we're going to get control over this?
Well, I'm actually a profound skeptic about a lot of this stuff. I mean, first of all, the systems we talk about, they're profoundly mythologized anyway. So the NSA itself, for example, is responsible for some of the stories about the capacity of its systems and how we should be all worried about their yottabyte storage capacity in their Utah data center. And plenty of computer scientists have looked at this and said that's just not possible, right? The arguments they're saying, what they say their capacity is not actually physically possible right now. The other thing was that with the NSA data center, I didn't go into this, but which is supposedly the biggest and most important data analytics center in the world right now, at least in military terms, is that one of the things that characterized the early weeks of that operation of that center was an enormous argument they had with the local government about water. Because actually these, as you know, these data centers require enormous amounts of water for cooling. And basically it's in Utah, right? Which is one of the hottest, driest places in the country. It requires enormous amounts of water in that situation. And essentially the local government can hold the NSA to ransom here by saying we're going to cut off your water supplies, which they threatened to do. And it's kind of ridiculous if you think about it. They've got this amazingly powerful national government with its surveillance infrastructure spanning the world, and yet somebody could say, we're going to cut off your water. And they're like, oh, God, no, don't do that. I mean, in some ways, the biggest threat to the NSA's thing would be, it'd be obvious what to do about it, right? It just, go in there and cut the water supplies. The whole thing burns out in about 3 days, destroys every kind of, everything they've got. Oh dear. It's like, they have some backups, of course, around the world in various places, of course, I'm sure. Well, maybe. You assume that they do, right? Because everybody backs their stuff up, don't they? Yeah. And by the way, I'm just going to tell you a story from my research just to show that that's not necessarily the case. It's like, just how in some ways, the old phrase that military intelligence is a contradiction in terms, how true that is. Do you know why we know about the original echelon systems, the things that, before Snowden we thought were how the NSA worked, this massive network of analysis? The main reasons we have the details we have relates to protesters at Menwith Hill, which is a major base in North Yorkshire, and this is what I did my PhD on. And essentially what happened was that all the documentation that is supposed to relate to this stuff, which was still on paper, and a lot of it still is today, was supposed to be incinerated, right? It's the obvious thing you do for security reasons. You incinerate all the documentation. There was an environmental inspection of the base by the Department of Defense's environmental section, and they decided that the incinerator was actually causing too much pollution. And this was a big problem, and it's an environmental age, it's the early 1990s, we have to do something about this. They closed down the incinerator for a few weeks. In theory, what you're supposed to do if you can't incinerate documents is to liquidize them. They use a household blender, by the way, in front of 2 other witnesses. Of course, that's ridiculous when you've got so much documentation. It's meant to be an emergency measure for particular things. Couldn't do it. So they basically got in the shredders. And they started shredding all the documentation and putting it in the bins. Of course, they employed a specialist contractor to take the stuff away, but it was still sitting in waste bins for a long time. The activists broke into the base, as they often did, took all the shredded material out of the bins, took it away, and spent months re-putting together all the shredded documents, which they then gave to Duncan Campbell, an investigative journalist, who then managed to show us the world, how this echelon system worked, what it was, all its components. And you're thinking, like, that wouldn't happen. The NSA are the world's leading spy agency. They wouldn't do that kind of thing. Well, they did, right? So I think one of the biggest vulnerabilities to these sorts of surveillance systems, first of all, is human stupidity, which will never end. Of course, maybe AI, of course, will come and save us all, which is what some people believe. But human stupidity seems unlimited. And actually that, basic security procedures in these organizations are extremely lacking. It's again how Edward Snowden managed to get everything he got was by asking people for their passwords. To say, I've got to sort out your, system, I need your password. The first thing you do if you're in military intelligence is that you know that if somebody has not got a password for something, they do not need it. Need to know, right? You never give your password to anybody in that context. People just willingly gave up their passwords to this sysadmin, because they needed their computers to work, or they were told their computers wouldn't work, and they didn't. In the NSA, and this is the best one, apparently, the best spy agency in the world. Well, so the Americans think. If that's the best one, what are the kind of procedures like in all the others? And I mean, in a sense, I don't want us to believe that we're protected by incompetence in that sense. But, as a British person, this tends to be our outlook on life, that we generally believe that in the fundamental incompetence of government, and that's what actually defend us in some ways. But it does seem to be one of our fundamental defenses. I think, of course, we have to develop better politics too. But I do believe that situation normal, all fucked up, is a pretty fundamental truth about the world, and especially in computing terms.
Thank you, David, for a very interesting talk. How to frame this question. I was thinking about, you talked a little bit about failure. In fact, I think you've talked a lot about the failure that's sort of implicit in this system. And most governance systems, if you follow the genealogy, are built on, failure, right? They're sort of congenitally failing operations. I wonder the extent to which this particular surveillance system that you've mapped out is actually maybe self-reflexive of its own failing operations, in the sense that it tries to incorporate the elements that would cause its failure, like trying to employ hackers to hack their systems in order to try to make them better. And so they know that this system is going to fall apart, it's going to fail, and they've just become very reflexive about this whole operation.
That's the fundamental basis of the internet, right? That was the whole purpose of it, is that it could fail in parts, but the system would work around it. I mean, that was the entire basis. Of course, that in itself is coming under challenge right now as national governments decide they're going to cut off bits of the internet or make their own networks. That sort of fundamental principle seems to be under threat in some ways. Although actually most countries don't really in practice have the resources to do this kind of thing in the way that they talk about. Brazil, for example, was talking about creating its own network architecture to go from Brazil to Africa, cutting out the US from the system. But in practice, that's not going to happen not in the same way they imagine, because there isn't the value in it, right? It's not going to generate the kind of money that would support that, at least not without other countries being involved, and therefore the vulnerability comes back in. I think it's right. I think all of these systems employ deliberate forms of hostile network operations in order to test, but also to see what happens when they fail. But there's also a political economic point here. In that a researcher called Clive Norris, who's one of the world's leading experts on CCTV, has looked at the way in which video surveillance has operated for years around the world, and basically shown that it just doesn't work, right? All the claims made about video surveillance are completely bogus in most cases. It doesn't prevent crime, except in very particular circumstances. Otherwise, Britain would be the most crime-free country in the world right now, It doesn't actually isn't very effective in actually even providing evidence for crime in many cases. There's all kinds of reasons for that, and you can say, yes, but if it was like this, it'd be better. If it was like this, it'd be better. And he came up, he used the quote from a Bob Dylan song. Of course, Bob Dylan, our new Nobel laureate in literature, who I now must, He wrote a song a few years ago which contained the lines, there's no success like failure, and failure is no success at all. In a sense, this is a description of how a lot of the political economy of security works. Like, every time something fails, it's an opportunity for a new round of security innovation which will deal with the problem of that particular failure. And when that fails, there'll be another kind of set of things. As you said, it's a kind of permanent cascade failure, which is almost genetically or whatever, deliberately designed to fail. So in some ways, no failure can ever be a reason for undermining the original premise of the system that it's for, right? The obvious thing we say, this doesn't work, we'll get rid of it. It's like, no, that's never the answer, right? The answer is always that you do something that then just fixes or adds on to the thing that was existed before. It's like a Microsoft theory of failure in this context. You never go back to the original programming, you just add on layers of code on top of it, which, as you know, works extremely well, and everybody has a great outcome with all the kind of things that we want. I know enough about programming to make jokes about it. It's like, I could be a programming comedian at least, perhaps.
This is a completely different kind of question. I hope you can sort of get it. I'm just trying to think conceptually about everything you've been talking about. So, yeah, so if, let's take in terms of a threat to a planetary system, what do you think? Would that threat more likely come from some source that manages to understand and operate within the system, but is culturally and ideologically insulated from the system? So I'll think of, it's kind of a crude example, ISIS. So it's anchored in a system which would be crudely classified as anti-modern or pre-modern or something. But of course, in fact, they're enormously sophisticated in their use of modern systems of communication, propaganda, etc. But they are permanently, in a sense, anchored in terms of their cultural mindset outside the system. And that's what really makes them threatening, is that they somehow exploit the system but are insulated from it.
Unless, of course, they're the future, of course, which is we always assume that these threats represent the past, but most people don't actually consider they might actually represent the future.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think they do represent the future, because ecologically it could be the same thing in terms of environmental groups.
Very much so, and I think there's a really interesting question here. Is like, and some people define ISIS as being actually a fundamentally postmodern organization, because in fact their roots in some kind of authentic Islam are very weak, right? Everybody would tell you that. Anybody who's actually Islamic will tell you that. They're not really fundamentally interested. In fact, the origins of ISIS itself seem to indicate that. This strange coalition of, various sort of ragtag rebel groups with ex-Saddamite intelligence operatives who decided to create an insurgent movement base. They used a figurehead they got from prison in Baghdad, who was, they didn't even have any belief in at all, who somehow taken over the organization itself. It's a kind of very weird story. It's certainly not some kind of authentic grounding in some ancient belief system which is, at odds with the modern world. It's a very kind of a contingent story that revolves around opportunism and all sorts of things. In some ways, that's the perfect postmodern terrorist group, right? It entirely uses the different kinds of sort of, affordances that are given to them by the world we've created in order to make themselves as destructive as possible within that system, while at the same time actually quite fundamentally, in some quite fundamental ways, being a total product of that, as you're saying. So I think you're right. I think the kinds of threats that we're looking at are going to be more and more like that. The question is to imagine what is an ISIS-like threat in a planetary infrastructure sense. Like, what kind of would that be? What would that look like when you're thinking about planetary computing? What would be the ISIS of biological computing on a planetary scale, for example? It's hard to think about that, but that's what I'm sort of trying to get to right now. Is what sort of, because I guess it's partly my science fiction inspirations, and some of this you may think is so way out, it's not worth thinking about. But I think we're entering a world where all of these things become possibilities, and they might not exactly work out in the kind of smooth way that I'm telling you. And in fact, the whole point is they will not work out in the smooth way that the narratives work. It'll work in some failed way. But to think about how these things will fail, where the failures will come from, where these threats will come from, what they will look like. If ISIS is a model for postmodern terrorism or postmodern threats, what would that look like in this context? And that's actually one of the reasons I wanted to give these talks. I'm not here to tell you how things are. I'm actually here to try and work out for myself, or help me work out exactly that question. So that's a really brilliant question, which I will go away and think about, because that's the key question, I think. So thank you, really, that's a great question.
Okay, let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.